At the beginning of this series called Adventures in Discipleship, I talked about the fact that I wanted to focus on one thing in each segment that could be an encouragement for you, maybe something that God has been teaching me throughout my life. And the one thing that I want to focus on today is this idea of good soil, that discipleship is about good soil in our lives. Now, it may feel like an odd time to be talking about soil when it's been probably the coldest week of our year so far, and it's been minus 35 or colder almost every day, and the ground outside is frozen solid and covered in a layer of snow. But on the other hand, maybe it's a good time to talk about this because we long for spring, we long for the warmth of the sun, and we long for things that can grow again once spring comes. One of the parables and the teachings of Jesus that has really impacted me this year related to this idea of soil is one that is often called the parable of the sower. And in many Bible translations, the publishers or whoever has put in the title in that segment that call it the parable of the sower. And I would probably rather title it the parable of the soils, because what Jesus is really teaching about here is the different kind of soils that are there in our lives that produce different kind of growth. So the first soil that he talks about this soil of the footpath and how the sower goes out and casts this seed, and the seed is the word of God, and some of it falls along the footpath, and the footpath is just hard and crusty, maybe like the frozen soil outside right now, and nothing grows. And the second path that he talks about is a path that is kind of rocky, and it has a layer of soil in it, but it has rock underneath, and so something maybe starts to grow a little bit, but then right away once persecution or troubles come, then it's just taken away, whatever growth is there. But it's the third and the fourth soils that are interesting to me especially. And when I think of the third one, it's one that I think each one of us can relate to, because it's this seed that falls among the weeds. And what Jesus says when he explains the parable is that he says it's the things that choke out the growth in our lives. And what chokes out the growth in our lives are things like the worries of this life, the lure of wealth, and the desire for other things. These distractions that take away the growth of the good soil that God has for us. And so when we tend to those, it reminds us of the fourth soil that Jesus says it's planted and it grows and it produces a crop that is 30, 60, and 100-fold. In other words, it's this abundance of growth, an abundance of life that God can produce in us. When I think of this, I also think of my childhood. And I remember my parents farming. My dad farmed for 48 years. And my dad used to take every spring, early on in the spring, he would take cake pans like this and get all of my mom's cake pans from the kitchen. And it was early in the season, and the weather outside was still cold, but the sun was warm. And he would take these cake pans and he would fill them with soil, and he would put in different seeds in them, like oats and wheat and barley and whatever he was seeding that year, and he was testing the germination rate of it. But what struck me about that is my dad would take these cake pans and he would place them on the windowsills around the house. And we would see them all around there throughout the spring. And for the next weeks we would watch, and I would be so intrigued by just seeing the growth that would slowly start to emerge out of the soil as these little sprouts started to go. And what struck me about that was this truth that we actually can't cause anything to grow. My dad couldn't cause those seeds to grow. But what he could do was he could focus on the environment. He could focus on good soil. He could focus on the warmth of the sun. He could focus on making sure that there was adequate water, maybe even tending to weeds that would sprout up. And in a similar way to what Jesus taught in this parable, I just want to encourage you and encourage me that we would, in our adventure in discipleship, that we would tend to the soil of our lives, that we would tend to the environment. And maybe it's paying attention to those things like the worries of this life, the lure of wealth, or the desire for other things that distract us from what God really has for us. So I pray that whatever season of life you find yourself in right now, that you would tend to and allow God to produce good soil in your life, that you can produce also good fruit, and that there would be abundant growth, and that you'd be encouraged.